Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of I'm Dan Malthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member, and you're with a virtual City Club forum. Today is May 26th. Back in January, we presented a forum with George McCarthy of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and Chantel Rush of the Kresge Foundation. It was the beginning of a series of conversations about equitable development. And we did that in celebration, and we're doing this series rather in celebration of the Lincoln Institute's 75 years of making a difference and building stronger communities through better land use policy. Specifically, we've been looking at how you grapple with the unique challenges of legacy cities and how you meet those challenges with solutions that are inclusive and create access to economic opportunity for everyone, not just for real estate developers and the business community. So we continue this series today with a deeper look at a very specific roadmap that has been developed by the Lincoln Institute along with the Greater Ohio Policy Center. It's an evidence-based blueprint focusing on the role individuals and institutions can play in really creating equitable development. Dr. Alison Goebel is with us. She's CEO of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. You may have spotted her a moment ago. That's a Columbus-based nonprofit which works on revitalization and sustainable growth across the state of Ohio. She's also one of the co-authors of the report that I mentioned. It's called Equitably Developing America's Smaller Legacy Cities, Investing in Residents from South Bend to Worcester. That's Worcester, Mass., not Worcester, Ohio. We're also joined by Jay Williams. You may remember him as the former mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. He is now the CEO of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. The Hartford Foundation is basically like Cleveland Foundation for Hartford, Connecticut. In his current role, he leads the foundation's efforts to address disparities in the Hartford community based on race, ethnicity, place, and income in order to make opportunities more available to everyone. So we'll talk with them about the report, about what equitable development might mean to Cleveland and other surrounding cities and legacy cities across the country. So as in every City Club forum, we are relying on you and your curiosity to bring us some questions and be a part of this conversation. If you have questions, you should text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can also tweet them at the City Club and we will work them into the program. Dr. Alison Goebel, Mayor Jay Williams, welcome to the program. Great to see you both.
Thank you. Thanks.
So let's start with this question about what equitable development actually is. Dr. Goebel, can you please, I know you have a definition that is probably tattooed on your forearm, but what is it? What is it exactly?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the invitation, and thanks to Lincoln Institute for being such a great partner to Greater Ohio. So we in the report talk about equity as being a goal that provides opportunity that is accessible to all, regardless of background and circumstance, that focuses on improving outcomes for low-income populations and communities of color to bring them into parity with white communities, basically. And so we have this overarching goal or sort of definition of equity. When we're talking about equitable development, we are really focused on real estate in the report, but also what are the investments that we could be making with and on behalf of residents to ensure that they are part of that process. And so for us, equitable development includes a lot of engagement, includes a lot of making sure that the table has seats placed for everyone and that everyone is given the space to provide their perspectives. So that sounds abstract. In the report, we're very concrete about what are the different strategies to accomplish that. And I should say, it's kind of fun talking about this report in Cleveland because we do profile a lot of Cleveland examples. And I will say this report's really for places that are more about saying to themselves, we need to commit to equity and we just don't really know where to start. And Cleveland, you've been doing this for a while, you've been making those strides, but there's many places around Ohio and across the country that are just now trying to kind of get themselves organized. They're committed to the ideals, but they're not quite sure where to start. And so this report is really for those places and giving some very concrete kind of first steps that they can take.
It's really interesting that you say that Cleveland is, kind of used as a model and an example, because I think a lot of people who work in economic development, community development in Cleveland would not see themselves as striving towards that, but not necessarily as having figured it out or created the equitable development that they really want to see. Mayor Williams, and I'm going to keep calling you Mayor Williams, and that's just the honorific that you earned 2005 to 2011 in Youngstown, Ohio. But now in Hartford, when you are talking about equitable economic development, equitable development throughout the city of Hartford, what does that look like specifically to you?
Well, thank you again for the invitation. Great to be here with Dr. Goebel. And it was just, entertaining to me to see a familiar 330 area code as you gave the number to text, as I've maintained my home phone number for the many years that I've been away. But I completely agree with Dr. Goebel when she talks about how she defined equitable development. And that's also how we look at it here in the greater Hartford region. And Hartford, while not in Ohio, is a legacy city. And for those of who appreciate history, the Connecticut Western Reserve, you're reached into Northeast Ohio, into the Cleveland area. So there is a historic connection here. I would simply enhance or add to Dr. Goebel's definition that equitable development does not mean identical, and it also has to be intentional. And I say that because when you talk about the structural disparities and inequities and the segregation and the exclusion that has occurred over the history of this country, it was very purposeful, it was very conscientious, it was very intentional. So when we talk about trying to repair the breach and try to create equitable approaches, we have to also be equally intentional and understand that equitable and identical aren't synonymous in this regard, because the communities that have been disinvested in, the communities that have suffered the disproportional effects of the inequities and disparities, have to also be invested in and have policies that acknowledge and address the systemic legacy deficiencies that have been created by this. So it does absolutely provide an opportunity for all communities to benefit. It provides for, as Dr. Goebel said, everyone to have a seat at the table, and not just have a seat at the table, but have their voice heard, recognized, and valued in a way that the outcomes lend themselves to over time. And that's the other thing, that this equity that we are seeking is incremental, is going to require time and patience and commitment, but it is absolutely not just aspirational. I believe it's achievable, but it has to occur in the confines or in the context of being intentional, understanding that equitably and identically investing in these policies aren't synonymous, and have to take into the account the still today lingering effects that communities like Cleveland, like Youngstown, like Hartford, like Worcester, Mass, like so many others, as Dr. Goebel talked about. You can just run off a list of legacy cities that would benefit significantly from the principles, the approaches, and the practices that are articulated in the publication that has been spoken of.
So, Mayor Williams, when you say, just to put a finer point on it, when you say it doesn't mean identical, it means there can be different levels of investment. I mean, I think what you're specifically saying is that you might have one neighborhood that receives a $10 million investment, and another neighborhood that has been historically a neighborhood that has received disinvestment and needs a lot further to go. And that neighborhood might require a $50 million, $100 million investment to bring it up to par with that of the first neighborhood.
That's exactly what it means. And also, when you think of policies, so the hard physical financial investment is one aspect of that, but also policies that recognize the differences between those neighborhoods and the compounding effects. And that's the other thing. This has occurred for so many decades that there's just like interest compounds when you put your money away, the serious effects compound and are exacerbated. So recognizing that policies have to make that differentiation, and that's where it becomes difficult, because people want to say, well, here's a policy that is a policy for all, and it provides that equitable development. So while it is well intended, if it doesn't have those nuances and acknowledgments of the history that we just talked about, it really isn't equitable. It can be well intended, but the impacts and the outcomes will not ultimately put us on a path that I think is very well articulated in the work that Dr. Goebel has championed.
Dr. Goebel, there's a line in the report that really jumped out at me. You wrote, as one of the three co-authors of this report, you wrote, an equity agenda cannot be built entirely on a city's real estate market. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Mayor Williams is so right. And we profile a number of cases of cities that have sort of tailored solutions to different neighborhoods, right? To ensure that parity is achieved by making sure that different supports, policies, and financials are available. So to the real estate question, so we as a group focused on revitalization around the state, we are often involved in conversations and concerns around gentrification, and that's a very real concern. And I don't want to diminish people's fears of displacement, cultural or physical. What we see, though, is that sort of the flashy solutions that come out of strong markets, right? Inclusionary zoning, developer extractions, those don't always work in small legacy cities. And I do want to.
What is a developer extraction?
So, or exaction. Anyway, the point is like saying like we're gonna, if you want to develop, we're gonna require you to put in 20% of the units you're going to build need to be available to income limited people, right? People who are making less than 60%. Or if you were going to build here, you need to make a contribution to a housing trust fund and X amount of dollars, right? On some sort of formulaic basis. And what we see in smaller legacy cities, and when I say smaller legacy cities in the report, we're talking about places that have 30,000 people to 200,000 people today and have lost population over time, right? So they probably had more at some point. Those places just have very fragile real estate markets, right? And so to think that equity, however defined, is going to be achieved solely through real estate development is hard to imagine in a place like Lorraine or Elyria or Mansfield. As much as I love those places, they just, like the scale is not achievable, and those real estate markets are so fragile already. To assume that only real estate is going to do that through potentially inclusionary zoning or these other methods, that seems like for us not the best use of leaders and advocates' energies, right? Like we think that you can achieve more equitable outcomes by focusing on other solutions, whether that's tenant protections, whether that's rental assistance, whether that's ensuring that folks are at the table so that neighborhood planning is deliberative and inclusive in the future. Those seem to us like better uses in some cases, not all cases, right? But are often better cases than sort of what is a very visible and flashy and has gotten a lot of attention, particularly in coastal stronger markets, on ways to address these disparities.
Because essentially, in the end, the Lorraines and Illyrias and Mansfields and Youngstowns, they need investment no matter what. And if you put those constraints, that may scare investors and developers.
Yeah, it's going to dampen any development interest if you have to, in a already tough development context, adding more from a developer's perspective, hoops to jump or hurdles, right? And again, this is not to diminish the end goals, but I think maintaining a view of what are we trying to accomplish and that there's multiple routes to get there. And that's, I think, one thing that we try to do in this report. I also want to say I'm the secondary author on this report. The first primary author was unavailable today, Erica Spade-Patras. But the point is that we are trying to outline a number of different routes to achieve equitable outcomes. Real estate being one route, but not the primary way.
Let's talk about some of the recommendations in the report. You say that top among them is building trust. And I want to ask you to describe that. Mayor Williams, I want to ask you to also describe kind of how that helped or where it was lacking, how the lack of it hindered things you were trying to do in Youngstown. But Dr. Goebel, you first. Why is the trust so important? It's sort of intuitive, but I also want to hear you discuss it.
Well, that's the thing. So much research and writing about legacy revitalization, even work that we've produced out of this office over the years, sort of just takes for granted that everyone's going to be playing well together, that everyone in a community is aligned around shared goals and visions. And the reality is that that's not the case in many communities, large, medium, or small, but particularly smaller legacy cities that have been so left behind and have just really been on the short end of so many different policy sticks. There is, we find in some communities, there's just a need to really focus on trust building before you do anything else, right? Because if there is mistrust, if there is skepticism, if there is, if you're not sure that that partner is with you 110%, then nothing really happens in these places, or it becomes extremely siloed and duplicative, which is not a good use of resources. So yeah, the very first recommendation we make is how to basically repair strained relationships and build trust. And again, provide very concrete examples of how other communities have done this.
Do you want to talk about a couple of those right now?
So, sure. So in one community, there were leaders from philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, and local government and private sector, so like the Chamber of Commerce, who didn't really hang out much together, didn't talk to each other. And so they brought in a third-party facilitator to really just kind of like do some basic meeting, like 101, like get to know each other, sort of facilitated meet and greets. But through that process, one of the partners we were working with was very deliberate and using actually a worksheet that we include in the report on sort of identifying where she thought there might be opportunities to connect with partners, as she was hearing sort of, maybe not for the first time, but in a more neutral zone, what are ways that, what are our interests that she might share with the Chamber of Commerce, or that another foundation might share with her. And so from there, she started to build what we call micro partnerships, right? And that was the way that that when COVID came, the community was able to move very quickly in providing response funds and kind of a coordinated response because they had some of this kind of just like early kind of conversations, like let's get coffee, let's not come in with a clear agenda, but just like let's get to know each other. Mm-hmm. All of that paid dividends when the crisis hit.
For sure. Let me just say, before we get to you, Mayor Williams, I wanted to remind our audience that if you have a question, you should text it to 330-541-5794 or tweet it at the City Club, and we will work it into the program. If you just tweet it at me, there's a chance I might catch it, but the likelihood is that I will miss it. Jay Williams, listening to Dr. Goebel talk, I was reminded of our mutual friend Chris Thompson's advice. I think you remember Chris from the Fund for Economic Future, and that back in those days, right. And he would always say, somebody needs to buy the donuts.
Somebody needs to buy the donuts. And let me give you a perfect example of why trust is so important. When the steel mills and the steel industry began to falter, really in the early to mid 60s, and it manifested itself most visibly in the 70s. And September 19th, 1977, people will tell you where they were, what they were having for breakfast when Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced its closure of its Campbell Works in Youngstown, Ohio, and tens of thousands of jobs were lost. Why trust was so important? Because from that date, the city of Youngstown, the greater Mahoning Valley community, was sold a bill of goods time and time again about how the next big idea was going to come in and bring back the jobs, the economic vibrancy, and all the things that the community had lost and that were so much defined by the steel mills. And I remember some of these vividly growing up in Youngstown. Some I do and some I don't. But there was a point after which the steel mills collapsed where an idea was put forward that they were going to build dirigibles, blimps, helium-filled blimps, at the Youngstown Municipal Airport. And this was going to be the next best thing to bring the economy back from the brink. And I would say, tongue-in-cheek, this was years after the Hindenburg disaster. Somehow the community got the notion and got excited about the fact that they were going to build dirigibles at the Youngstown Municipal Airport. I remember as a teenager that then Governor Bill Clinton and Al Gore came to the Southern Park Mall parking lot and promised that if he was elected, it was going to be a Defense Finance Accounting Center, DFAS, was going to be built in downtown Youngstown and was going to create thousands of jobs, high-paying government jobs that would really be a boon to the economy. So as you can imagine, the blimps were never built. And as you can imagine, Clinton was elected and the DFAS Center didn't come to Youngstown. It did end up somewhere in Cleveland, and no taking nothing away from Cleveland. And there were several of those things that over the course of a decade or so, the trust eroded, the cynicism increased in that vacuum that was created, a whole host of things that were detrimental to the community. So it wasn't until we had a cathartic, honest conversation about what Youngstown was and wasn't going to be, about what it could achieve on a much smaller, more realistic, manageable scale, that the community began to rebuild that trust that allowed us to engage in a planning effort that was Youngstown 2010. And even then, there was a caution not to oversell Youngstown 2010 as a utopia that was going to put the city back into, quote unquote, its glory days, but instead it required really going through a psychological and emotional process that the community had to go through to begin rebuilding that trust and then buying into the notion of how you would invest in a city like Youngstown, in a community like the Mahoning Valley. And it was at that point we started seeing some successes. And I'll end by saying one of the areas I completely agree again with Dr. Goebel in terms of real estate not being the only or the primary mechanism in these cities with very fragile real estate, but where Youngstown did excel was with its ability to capture and redirect investment into some of those former manufacturing sites. So while it wasn't the traditional real estate that you might see in a downtown or some of the larger cities, Youngstown did prosper by being able to have directed, targeted, and very thoughtful investment into some of those sites that ultimately helped to rebuild the tax base that had eroded over the course of so many decades.
You were requiring a lot of trust of the community at the time too, because you were saying we're going to get smaller. The glory days are not coming back. And that was a big ask of your community.
It was, and it required, the community buy into this notion that, no candidate for mayor, no mayor would say, hey, we're going to be smaller is better. When you think, oh, we got to be 50,000, so we're an entitlement city at HUD. We've got to be 100,000, so we can be in sort of the big city club. This notion of accepting that we were smaller, to me, we had seen and been promised the exact opposite and only became more frustrated, only became more cynical. So, to say, hey, we have assets that we can build on. We have assets because Youngstown was at one point 180,000, was designed to accommodate a quarter of a million. We've got lots of assets that are remnants from the days when we had 180,000 that cities that were only 50 or 60,000 might never have. Architectural, cultural, natural resources. So let's take those resources and build on them and use them as the catalyst to be a smaller, better city. And again, it still had its flaws, but people began to buy into that notion, take ownership of their role in that, much more than sort of sitting back waiting for the federal government to write a check or this brilliant business person to come in and say, here's the panacea, for Youngstown's ills.
I want to remind folks that the report is called Equitably Developing America's Smaller Legacy Cities. You can find it on the webpage for this event at cityclub.org or on the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy's website at lincolninst, lincolninst.edu. Just click on publications. And while you're there as well, you can also register for an upcoming webinar. It's June 29th, where practitioners who are part of, I think some of whom have been a focus of the Greater Ohio's Policy Center's report, will discuss how they've implemented some of the strategies we're talking about. And I want to move on to another strategy, Alison Goebel, specifically, and I don't know that we're going to get to all of them because I think you got about 7 or 8 that are really key, but building a layered and diverse coalition for this. Like, this is not the work of one entity or one office inside of City Hall. Talk a little bit about what those coalitions look like and how you build them.
Yeah. So first, I want to just rewind very quickly to trust, but it's going to connect to this coalition question, which is that, so we are really impressed by what happened in Lancaster, Pennsylvania a few years ago, where city staff said, you know what, the exclusionary policies, the redlining that has come out of our offices have led to the conditions of the neighborhoods that they are today. And we take ownership of that. And the city and staff issued a public apology that said, we acknowledge that the city messed up and that we are responsible for this and that it is our responsibility to fix this. And we are looking to you to help guide what is the right solutions, right? And that public apology, I mean, what Mayor Williams was saying was cathartic, right? And that it really started to help build that trust. So in terms of the coalition building, what we see in places like Lancaster, Indianapolis, other places, is that when there is very deliberate decision to say we need to get a lot of different diverse voices who have a stake in whatever the policy may be or the issue is, that there is just better policy making in general, right? So in Indianapolis, this is probably a very familiar case to Clevelanders, but a few years ago, Indianapolis said, we are going to expand our transit system and we're going to build BRT, like the health line, and we are going to expand it everywhere. And the way that, and there's a lot of kind of state and local policy hoops they had to jump. They brought in grassroots folks, they brought in the business sector, they brought in philanthropy, and nobody was super, like, no one person or one entity was really in charge of the effort, right? That they had the grassroots folks and like the ministers from Black neighborhoods co-equally leading this coalition, and sort of the decisions they were making and the vision of the map that they wanted to see for service co-equal with the Chamber of Commerce, right? And so like this is where basically you have alignment across the city or across the community from all sectors, basically saying like, we have a shared vision and we are all going to contribute our unique expertise and skills and Rolodexes to achieving that.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me though that you really do need to focus people's attention on a specific problem. Because if you bring people together and say, let's try and fix it all. We tried to do this a couple of years ago with an effort called Cleveland Rising. And like, there was all this great, like there was a lot of trust built and there was a lot of ideation and a lot of people felt, I think, empowered to make a difference, but it was a little ethereal in the end. And I mean, a lot of the work isn't over and there's still work continuing, but there was this feeling like it lacked focus because it's boiling the ocean, yada, yada, all of that sort of thing.
Totally.
Jay,
I mean,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say what we see in communities, particularly smaller legacy cities, which like maybe are just kind of getting over whatever the personal beefs that might exist between leaders or whatever, right? Like starting small, kind of working out that muscle, and then building up to bigger and bigger wins, right? Like that's sort of the incremental gains that Mayor Williams was talking about. That's where we really see. So, but you're right, Dan. The key point is like, what is the problem we're going to fix today? What is the problem we're going to fix tomorrow? And like, instead of boiling the ocean.
Mm-hmm. And it is important. And that was, when you mentioned Cleveland, it is important to have a vision that excites and galvanizes people and gets them sort of thinking differently about the future of their community. But you're both right. It is then equally important, if not more, to have an incremental approach and plan. So, the Cleveland Rising vision gets people excited and we're all ready to go. What are the steps that we're going to take? And then those successes breed additional confidence for more successes. And the more you do that, there does become a set of decisions that are very ambitious, very difficult. But if you got those early wins, it then begins to build the confidence. Hey, we can do this. We demonstrated that we can set aside as Dr. Goebel said, the differences that have existed politically or ideologically. We can move forward together in a way that at the end of the day, ultimately, after a series of wins and the course of time, you find that vision that was talked about is actually come into fruition. And I think, to Cleveland's credit, a lot of that has transpired. When I was in DC, the perception that people had of the Midwest as flyover country, the perception that people had of Cleveland was the Cuyahoga River fire. And I really got a kick out of the fact that on a number of occasions, my travels took me to Cleveland and some of my colleagues would come. And when they saw Cleveland, and this was Cleveland as it existed, during the Obama administration, when they saw the Cleveland that had the investments in the medical technology, when they saw the Cleveland that was had embraced and begun to really embrace the natural resources of Lake Erie and so many other things, it was awe-inspiring. I mean, just to really see that this is what happens when a community begins to incrementally envision a future and then move toward it. And again, I'm sure progress has been made. It's been probably a year or so since I've been to the city, but progress has been even furthered since then. And I do believe that places like Cleveland do serve as a model.
You're welcome back anytime, Mayor Williams. Absolutely. So just to close that part out, I mean, when we're talking about a layered and diverse coalition, we're talking about sort of grass tops to grassroots and across the community as well. Another area, and we're going to get to audience questions in a second, but another area that you talk about is recalibrating existing operations to yield equity. Dr. Goebel, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so we end the report providing examples of different entities, whether local governments or nonprofits, who have said we are committing to an equity agenda and we are going to take steps to do that. So, I think a lot of organizations, ours is included at Greater Ohio, are re-examining the vendors and contractors we use and trying to make a deliberate effort to hire minority-owned, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. But we also talk about a great tool that exists from a group called GAR that will come into a city and help you basically do a racial equity audit. We talk about actually a affordable housing lender here that's based in Columbus, who now requires all of their borrowers to provide a living wage, to make a good faith effort to hire minority contractors, and to they also say that the developments that their borrowers are building must not discriminate based on source of income, right? So these are and this is written into basically a memorandum of understanding that they establish with the borrower. So Cleveland Development Advisors is doing very similar work with their borrowers. And so when we talk about recalibrating operations, it's both certainly internal, right? Like you gotta get your own house in order, but then also what are the influence and levers that you as an organization can pull with the other partners or clients or borrowers that you're working with to help them kind of move in shared goals around equity. So those are just a few examples that we talk about, but that's, all of this sort of is a little bit kind of window dressing, maybe not window dressing, but a lot of this is like, we got to look internal to our organizations and how we operate if we're going to be very serious about this.
Dan, if I could just add to that.
Please do, Mayor.
She's explained, Dr. Goebel's explained exactly what's happening here in Hartford. So the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving is the largest community foundation in the state of Connecticut. And again, one of the 20 largest in the country, along with places like the Cleveland Foundation. And internally, we are going through our own internal journey and have been for the past year and a half or so, about recalibrating the things that Dr. Goebel talked about, our own relationship with our vendors, our relationships with our stakeholders and partners, and certainly with respect to our grant making, committing and centering ourselves on an equity agenda and talking about it in the notion of committing ourselves to participate in the dismantling of structural racism and increasing social and economic mobility in communities of color. And it is not an easy process to go through, but it recognizes that most community foundations, if you think about, the oldest community foundation in the country is the Cleveland Foundation. And you think about these large, wealthy community foundations, the wealth was amassed in a time where there was, engendered discrimination, racial and ethnic discrimination, discrimination against women, and a whole host of minority groups. So this wealth was amassed in a time where there was not equal opportunity to amass wealth or to have access to capital. So taking an appreciation of the historic origins that we have, but also now going through that process of being introspective and humble about how we commit ourselves and center ourselves to an equitable agenda. And like the Cleveland Rising, we also are working with a number of other stakeholders here in the greater Hartford region in an initiative that has been dubbed Hartford 400, that is taking what may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, at least in our lifetime, to understand and appreciate the ARPA funding that is coming in as a result of the COVID pandemic, and how we have a chance to undo and rethink some of those past policies that were so inequitable, that were so discriminatory, as we think about the path forward. Coincidentally, as the city of Hartford prepares to celebrate its 400th anniversary in about 8 to 10 years. That's a part of how we're setting ourselves and going through that process that Dr. Goebel talked about.
That's a really significant point that you raised, Mayor Williams, in that both the historical underpinnings of our kind of philanthropic ecosystem and the problematic nature of all of that, which we've talked about at the City Club before. Edgar Villanueva spoke on it, and as well as Anand Girdardis. But also this incredible opportunity that cities around the nation, particularly the most poor cities around the nation, inside of Cuyahoga County, I think we're expected to receive a total, if you add it all up, it's going to be over $1 billion coming into Cuyahoga County through this federal stimulus investment. And it really does represent a generational opportunity to eliminate systemic poverty. and to implement some of these things that we've been talking about. So if you're interested, you should check out the report, Equitably Developing America's Smaller Legacy Cities. You can find it on the Lincoln Institute's website. You can find it on our website, cityclub.org. And you're also encouraged to sign up for that webinar I mentioned earlier as well, that the Lincoln Institute will be hosting. We're talking with Alison Goebel. She is the Executive Director, President, CEO of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. And Jay Williams, former mayor of Youngstown, former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development in the Obama White House, and currently the president and CEO of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, which I only remember because it's right above his right shoulder. If you have questions, please text them to 330-541-5794 or tweet them at the City Club and we'll work them into the program. We're delighted to have a few questions here right now. No legacy city is an island. All are surrounded by suburban neighbors. Is there a role for regional strategies to address social and economic disparities in these places? And if so, what could those look like? What are the best practices here? Mayor Williams, let's start with you.
Not only is there a role for regional strategies and acknowledgement of the city's role in the region is essential. Without that, I think that these things are doomed to fail. They will live a life for a period of time because cities, the borders are porous. The economics, the investment, the whether people believe it or not, the elements of crime and things that plague a city aren't confined artificially to those lines on a map. They are often concentrated in the city, but part of that sometimes it's benign neglect and sometimes it is intentional conscious neglect. Mm-hmm. So the regional view and the regional understanding is essential. I fought for that. As mayor of Youngstown, I'm sure to the dismay and disdain of sometimes some of our regional, my regional colleagues, but I've never found anyone who could undercut the argument that a stronger Youngstown was a stronger Boardman. A stronger Youngstown was a stronger Canfield and Austintown. There's nothing positive that could happen in the central city that didn't have a ripple beneficial effect to the outlying regions, but the exact opposite is true. The challenges and struggles of Youngstown would overshadow the rest of Mahoning Valley, no matter how quaint and how charming some of those other, and I don't mean that pejoratively or sarcastically, but how much those other suburbs love the quality of life. It was always connected at somehow and at some point to Youngstown. And the same thing I'm sure holds true for Cleveland and its surrounding suburbs, Hartford and its surrounding suburbs. So yeah, a regional strategy, while much more difficult, while politically fraught, has to be, and it's not that you have to wait for that to materialize before you begin the core city, but you can't just say we're going to have the core city issues and somehow the region will take care of itself.
And Dr. Goebel, the regional strategy, it becomes all the more important when in the context of a lack of population growth. Because I mean, I'm sitting here, just in a suburb of Cleveland, where like downtown, when the malls and the transportation policy kind of pushed people out to the suburbs, the retail grew in the suburbs, and the retail is almost non-existent, continues to be close to non-existent downtown.
Yeah. So we at Greater Ohio have done work not contained in this report, but in other reports that show that declining center cities are leading to declining regional metros. That's actually very apparent in the Dayton region, but also other places around the state. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a regional, there's a need for a regional solution, right? I will say in our report, we say, just focus on your own community first, right? Because it is so hard to do the regional, right? And that that you can scale up these solutions. But I mean, that's the other thing too, is that we were really clear in this report is that our solutions here, like you can start them at any time and you can just get going, right? And the regional stuff, you just gotta, that's just like another layer of part of people, right? So there's no doubt that a regional solution is really important. I love the work that the Fund for Economic Future does. I love the work that other regional partners are doing in Northeast Ohio, and they're kind of equivalents around the state. But so I'm not dismissing the fact that we need to have regional solutions. They're just really hard, right? So it's sort of like what's like a little bit of get your own house in order type of thing, right? And bring others along through those successes.
And by doing that, by having success in the central city, it helps to engender some of the conversations, because people want to be around winners. People want to be around things that seem successful. So if you start with, oh, the problems in the core city, you got to help us fix it, she's absolutely right. But if you start getting your house in order, they are connected. Those surrounding communities are connected to the core city in ways in more ways they can even imagine. But by engendering and starting there, I absolutely agree that it makes it a little bit more palatable when you start then talking about, let's build on this success that happened in the core city and talk about how this also benefits the region.
I want to keep with this a bit of this regional conversation for a second, because it is part of the broader context in which this work happens, no matter what. And this question's from Eric Wobser, who I think both of you know, the currently city manager in Sandusky. He writes, as a city manager of a legacy city, how can we expand the conversation around equity to a regional level when so much inequity in small legacy regions is a direct result of middle-class residents with mobility fleeing legacy cities while continuing to benefit from being part of the legacy city's labor market, cultural amenities, and more? I think you'd sort of hit the nail on the head there, Mayor Williams.
Again, therein lies the $1 million question, because the legacy cities still provide a significant benefit to the region. When you talk about the employment centers, the cultural institutions, oftentimes the educational institutions, and because it has been so easy for so long to derive the benefits from the legacy city without having to bear the full cost or make the fair contributions, I think that's where this investment that you talked about, that is probably once in a generation, acknowledging and making sure that the investment directed to these legacy cities is thoughtfully deployed to, part of it is the carrot to try to attract some of the conversation. I also believe at times you have to use a stick. I oftentimes lamented the fact that in Ohio, we would subsidize the expansion of the infrastructure at the expense of the cities. That the developers could develop greenfields and farmland with state subsidies that did not acknowledge the fact that was happening and exacerbating the decline from some of our central cities. So I had no problem with suburban or exurban development. I had a problem with it being subsidized or coming at the expense or exacerbating the issues in our core cities.
It's it becomes very obvious when you think about those amenities, whether it's Sandusky and the kind of lakefront amenities that people in surrounding communities are enjoying right there in Sandusky, or in Youngstown, where, like Boardman High School is a great place to go to high school because it's a pipeline to Youngstown State, right? If Youngstown is it fails and Youngstown State is on the chopping block, that relationship no longer works. Dr. Goebel, anything to add on that?
Just that we've seen in other regions, I'm thinking of Indianapolis and Syracuse, actually, that have used a lot of data. And frankly, private sector has led those conversations and has said, look, this is a priority to us to take a regional approach to solutions, equitable solutions. So just wanted to raise those two. And we provide longer profiles of those in the report. But the data piece and also who the messenger is really important sometimes to elevating this to a serious regional conversation.
Mm-hmm. She's absolutely right. It wasn't lost on me that as the mayor of Youngstown, my message to the suburban communities seemed self-serving. I got that. So to the extent that regional players, like in our instance, Youngstown State University, or the corporate community, and that's where Hartford is benefiting from still having a significant corporate community who, when they lend their voice to this, carries a lot heavier weight and less politically tagged than an elected official.
Another question. So often revitalization and development is focused on new hot neighborhoods. Previously hot neighborhoods are then discarded, and often the investment they previously enjoyed are diverted to the new neighborhood. How can we create sustainable revitalization rather than just moving investment and resources around so-called hot neighborhoods? Dr. Goebel.
That's a good question. So one of the things we talk about in our report is the value of planning, right? Which I think probably everyone on this webinar is going to agree with. But anyway, we do talk about the value of planning and also the value of anticipating neighborhood change, right? And so being proactive so that change that's negative is mitigated, but also benefits are retained. So it is hard, the private market's going to do what the private market does, but there are lots of ways that the city, through the benefits that they provide to developers, can help sort of steer, but there's also the nonprofits and local leaders are also in a position to kind of help keep that stickiness in the neighborhood that might soon to be discarded for the next hot thing. So again, it's sort of everyone's responsibility to find solutions and contribute the unique expertise or skills that they can to these larger goals.
I think the other thing is important here is recognizing that most cities of this size, most cities aren't made up of a bunch of hot neighborhoods.
Well, that too. That's why I kind of paused. I was like,
stable neighborhoods. Yeah, it's great and it's fun and it's sexy to have a couple of hot neighborhoods. But if you get a city that by and large has mitigated some of its deteriorating or struggle neighborhoods, brought them to some sense of stability, has a core of stable neighborhoods, and then you sprinkle in a few hot neighborhoods. So that's the thing, is cities themselves have to recognize, while it's tempting to chase the hot neighborhood, it is more lasting and of greater value to have stable, solid neighborhoods that may not be the cutting edge place where people are trying to go, but they're not the places where working middle class families feel they have to flee. So
this is what the CDC community, the Community Development Corporation community of practice refers to as the middle neighborhoods, right? Right. Yeah.
They may be boring. They may be like boring. Oh, they've got people.
They're just residential neighborhoods where like kids can ride their bikes.
Yeah, you got to place a couple coffee shops. It's not where the next tech wizard is going to come and invest $10 million, but that's okay.
I mean, I would also say smaller legacy cities, they need strong downtowns. So if downtown is hot, that's not a problem actually, right? And it's likely that nobody's really living in downtown, or if they are, it's probably deplorable conditions, right? And like buildings that haven't been touched in years. So, by the owner. So downtown redevelopment is not a bad thing in these places like Mansfield, Elyria, Akron, So Mayor Williams, I totally agree. I was like, wait, these places don't really have hot neighborhoods that are like bouncing around.
But I used to chuckle. You can create all these you can take a farm out in the suburb and create this lifestyle communities. I was like, guess what? They're called downtowns, or they're called downtowns 50 years ago. And you can't recreate the iconic skyscrapers, and you can't recreate the neoclassical architecture in these downtowns. So when you are able to renew them, then they do become, and that is where for 40 years nobody lived in downtown Youngstown virtually, and then over the past 15 years, downtown Youngstown all of a sudden became the hot real estate market. So,
It's funny. I'm like thinking about the way that residential development has like sort of shifted over the decades, and there was a moment in the mid 90s when the Disney Corporation created a place called Celebration, Florida.
Yep.
And it was such a shift, right? Because it was like this corporation was going to like create this place that was going to be all American in some fashion, right? And use this like quintessentially American architecture. And it was just, you kind of put up your hands and you think like, well, why not just like actually invest in these cities?
Indiana or Toledo or Youngstown or
right.
I mean, like we've got a bunch of these places across the country.
Yeah, it was very like, but I think that sort of, I don't know, I hesitate to call it like the Floridification or the Disneyfication of residential development. But that has just sort of happened over and over and over again throughout the recent history of community development. And it's
old is new again, fascinated to recycle what has already been treaded.
So here's
this
question.
is the competitive advantage of these places, right? Like they already are walkable. They already have this awesome architecture, you have single family homes that are affordable, right?
So like authenticity isn't in finger quotes.
Right. Yeah, right. So, I mean, frankly, this remote working situation we're in, like it presents a huge, we're all talking about it, but like legit, it's a real opportunity for these smaller legacy cities, as long as they can get broadband access. So we need to make sure the feds and states are providing broadband access.
That's it. That's another topic.
Another topic
connected to, this long thread of conversations we have at the City Club. This question via Twitter is sent to us at the City Club. Would love to hear Mayor Williams and Dr. Goebel offer perspective on what seems to be the need for a pivot from participation, i.e. seats at the table, to voice and true agency, i.e. a shared table, and on strategy for how to transition that can be achieved to gain a more just future. Dr. Goebel.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of a lot of communities around the country are trying to struggle with this. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the community I mentioned that issued that public apology from the city itself, they are doing this, we think, pretty well. And so they've created actually a citywide CDC that is called Lancaster Equity CDC, which is really focused on trying to ensure that there is that shared table, right? So it's not just like the seat, but the sharing of the table. And one way that they started that process was by investing heavily in community organizers, like people who are outdoor knocking and saying, we are here because we want to hear things that you have been thinking about that you have not had an outlet to share it in. And we are going to take this and we are going to then organize conversations, and we are going to create the environment so that you have that voice and that we are creating that space and making sure that the right ears are listening. And so, that the work there has been a lot of just block and tackle with individual community organizers, and it's not happening overnight, but that commitment and even just kind of creating an entity that is charged with this and that is that requires and expects respect from all the other nonprofit and philanthropic and public and private sector partners in the city has really started to shift just the dynamics in really positive ways. So Lancaster Equity and the work that they're doing there in Pennsylvania, we think is a really great example of how that can actually be done.
We are attempting to do that same thing as a community foundation, as a funder, is to share the space, share the power, not just from the grantor-grantee relationship, which has somewhat of a paternal dynamic to it, but instead invest in ways that we're looking at many of these partners and peers, negotiating and having a conversation with them and having them share with us their aspirations and the expectations they have of us and the expectations they have of their ability to move the needle in this community. So again, it's a humbling process, particularly when you think of the platform that wealthy community foundations typically sit as, lording over, and I use that term gingerly or broadly, lording over the community with all their wealth and spreading that wealth through their grant making process, as opposed to saying, listen, we need to share this power. We need to share our space in a way that may cause us to rethink or to hear some things about ourselves that while we were perhaps well-intended, that was not ultimately the space that we're in. So I completely agree that it is a necessary ongoing process of institutions that have historically been rooted in power to make sure that recognizing the agency, you can't give agency, they already have agency, but recognizing the agency of other stakeholders in the community and respecting that agency.
Mayor Williams, do you have a citizens grant making committee? A lot of foundations are now setting these up. I assume you guys were, right? So that's one very concrete example of where you're actually sharing power, because you're here's this pot of money, we want you to do the grant making with.
We did. I'm glad you said that. So we serve 29 towns, and 2 years ago we established a fund in each of the 29 towns where those towns have a committee. They make their own grant making decisions. And it has been a wonderful process, both in terms of for us in learning and those communities and understanding. Our only sort of requirement was that they had a diverse committee that represented, their own towns, and to see some of those towns begin to appreciate and rethink about what diversity means. But yeah, absolutely. So there's 29 of them that we established about 2 years ago.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it reminds me of the calls for some degree of participatory budgeting with regard to the big stimulus dollars and investments that are happening. I know that it's complicated, but it always seems like kind of a small percentage that is offered to these community boards for participatory budgeting or participatory grant making. And I get it that it's like a big risk to say, we're going to give you 25% or 50%, right? Or turn it all over. It's more like an experiment in power sharing than it is real power sharing. Jay?
Hartford has done that, and it's an initiative called Hartford Decides. And so I credit the community for doing it, but you're right. And I'll say, as a former mayor, you think you already have enough battles with your city council about their legislative ability and having the purse strings. So then, as a mayor, you're probably thinking, okay, now I've got city council and I've got another group over here. So will you ever get anything done? That's not to say it's not the right approach. With the legislative body, it's a legal requirement. And with these citizens participatory, you get more buy-in. So it is the right thing to do. But I mean, that's where the human nature of, oh man, I've got to now, go and convince and battle, and will the dollars get to where I think they should go? But it is, and I credit Hartford for having that process. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it's a process that is very much in place here.
Dr. Alison Goebel.
Yeah, so I was going to share that just last night, I helped facilitate a conversation in Mansfield, Ohio, which was set up by the Chamber of Commerce, the local foundation, and the local news source there, Richland Source. And they invited mayors, commissioners, and city council members, and then community leaders and kind of general, average day residents. And we had a conversation about the ARPA dollars. And so from Greater Ohio's perspective, we were just saying, like, here are some parameters you might want to think about the dollars about. But we were asking through the chat throughout the event, like, what do you think are the top priorities today? What do you think need to be the top priorities for the ARPA dollars in the future? And these were not binding, right? But it was a good temperature check and a good way to then launch those longer term conversations that would be much more participatory. I also want to say that Mansfielders pulled this together in like 5 weeks, which just goes to show you how nimble small legacy cities can be, right? Like everyone knows each other. They just like get it done. So
I mean, that was always one of the assets. I love Cleveland, but that was always one of the digs I'd say at Cleveland is like, listen, I can get the university president and the corporate CEOs in a room with a couple of phone calls, so we can move nimbly. We're not as big as Cleveland, not as well known, but to your point, the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities also has assembled a multifaceted stakeholder group to have the similar conversations about the ARPA dollars here in the state. So that's a validated approach.
Youngstown may be better known than Cleveland. I mean, you guys had a Bruce Springsteen song. This may be the final question we have time for, but it's somewhat easy to get investors to invest in the up and coming communities and neighborhoods. How do you get them to think outside the box and invest in neighborhoods of color? Mayor Williams.
I think that there are multiple cases to be made. In fact, there was a gentleman, Jeff Furrer, who was executive vice president of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, who made a compelling case that in every instance, companies are more profitable. The outcomes are longer lasting when you have an intentional, inclusive, diverse approach to your investment that without fail. And so he made the business case and showed financially why this was important and necessary, and the detriment when you don't approach it intentionally this way. So alongside that, I mean, there's certainly the moral or the social case of the notion of you are just leaving talent and creativity on the sidelines when you don't invest in communities of color. So, I mean, there are so many ways to come at it, but I thought that was one of the more compelling, because while there was a social justice argument that was, indisputable, he tied it very neatly to the financial benefits to the broader community and to corporations by having these investments in our communities of color.
Alison Goebel, the report kind of calls that out, that philosophical underpinning, as like this is why we do this, not just because it's the moral thing, but because it's better for the economy.
Yeah, that's right. We spend like a whole chapter outlining and kind of referring to various academic studies, Fed studies, Urban Institute studies that show that, you're leaving a lot on the table if you are not investing in communities of color, and that in fact, by that at this point inequities are just sort of replicating themselves, right? That they're deepening it and so it's not like these external forces, it's sort of at this point self-perpetuating. And so breaking that reaps huge benefits. So Mayor Williams, I'm glad that you've raised that, because that is definitely the case, right? Like that there's a financial economic case here in addition to all the very important social justice and moral issues here as well.
Dr. Alison Goebel runs the Greater Ohio Policy Center, which is kind of at the forefront of this report we've been talking about. Jay Williams is president of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and former mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, and the former assistant secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. You've disappeared from my screen, but I want to thank you both very much for being a part of this today. I want to thank all of you for joining us. We have talked a lot about the report. It's called Equitably Developing America's Smaller Legacy Cities, Investing in Residents from South Bend, Indiana to Worcester, Massachusetts. And you can find it on the webpage for this event on our website, cityclub.org, or on the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy's website at lincolninst.edu. Just click on publications. And while you're there, I want to encourage you to register for the webinar, which is coming up on June 29th, where practitioners will talk about how they've implemented some of these strategies that we've talked about. This forum today is presented by the Lincoln Land Institute for Land Policy and Mansur Gavin, LPA, in honor of the Lincoln Institute's 75th anniversary. We're very grateful for their support. All City Club virtual forums are presented for free every week, thanks to generous support from Bank of America, KeyBank, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and PNC. You can join them in supporting the City Club's mission by making a contribution online, becoming a member, or texting the word donate to 216-616-CLUB. That's 216-616-2582, and follow a few easy steps to make your donation. We really appreciate it if you would do that. I'm Dan Moulthrop. Stay close in your hearts, my friends. We will be close in person soon. Public Square this summer. We're counting on it, and we cannot wait. So our forum is now adjourned. Thank you very much.